The most disruptive thing I've ever done was walk into a room. Not with a speech, not with a demand, not with a plan to change anyone's mind, just by being there. When we hear the word disruption, we tend to think of something loud, something dramatic, something that breaks the world wide open in a single moment. We might picture protests, walkouts, movements that announce themselves before they even arrive. Disruption in our minds is noise. This past summer, I interned in energy investment banking in Houston, Texas. And if you know anything about energy or finance, you already know exactly what kind of room it was that I walked into. Oil and gas, high finance, two industries built on tradition, hierarchy, and systems that evolve very slowly. Now, I knew I would be outnumbered, but I had no idea just how right I would be. Out of 10 interns, I was the only woman, and I was one of 2 female investment bankers in my entire office. But I want to get something straight now. My story is not about being the first woman to walk into a room like that. Women have been doing that since long before me, often with far less support and far higher stakes. What makes my story meaningful is not the novelty of it. It's the visibility. Because when someone who doesn't fit the default suddenly occupies a space, what used to feel neutral suddenly becomes noticeable. Not because anyone changed, but because the room did. We like to think of professional workspaces as neutral and objective, merit-based. But decades of research in organizational psychology suggests that neutrality is often an illusion. See, it's very rare that workplaces evolve from scratch. Generally, they evolve over time, shaped by the people that have historically occupied them, their norms, their communication styles, their assumptions. Over time, these patterns begin to feel natural to us. And what feels natural is often mistaken for what is neutral. Psychologists call this affinity bias, the unconscious tendency to favor those that feel familiar to us. Not because we're trying to exclude anyone, but because familiarity feels safe, comfortable, efficient, even. But it influences who gets mentored, who gets trusted early, who gets the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong. And it shapes our culture in ways that are sometimes hard to see until someone different enters the room. That's when the illusion of neutrality starts to fracture. Not because the system changed, certainly did not, but its participants did. Here's the idea that put everything into perspective for me. When you occupy a space that wasn't built with you in mind, you pay small costs that no one names or talks about, whether you're the first or the 50th. Now, these costs aren't dramatic, they're quiet, and that's why they're so often ignored. They show up as constant monitoring of your tone, your body language, your facial expressions. They show up as calculation. Is this comment worth the risk? Is this the right time to speak? And they show up as pressure, not just to perform well, but to perform flawlessly. Psychologists refer to this as identity-based cognitive load, the concept that people from underrepresented groups expend significant mental energy simply assessing whether they're safe, welcome, or being evaluated differently. That extra cognitive load has real effects. Identity-based cognitive load narrows creativity, suppresses participation, reduces risk-taking. And it's not because anyone is any less capable, but because their environment demands more from them before the real job even begins. Understanding this context is important, because without it, we can misread what we see. We might interpret caution as lack of confidence, silence as lack of engagement, adaptation as weakness. But what looks like hesitation is often strategy. For me, this didn't feel like fear. It was an awareness. Awareness of how my mistakes might be interpreted. Awareness that the work that I put in wasn't just a reflection upon me and my efforts. I felt like it was a reflection upon my whole sex. That awareness shaped how I spoke, how I asked questions, how I took up space. And it wasn't because I was any less capable, it was because I was adapting. But here's the thing about adaptation. It's invisible to those who don't have to do it. There was a moment at the end of my summer that brought this into focus for me. When a colleague approached me to apologize for using a slur in front of me earlier that summer. Not because it was wrong, but because he didn't know I was gay. Now, that's an imperfect apology, but it revealed something important. People rarely change because they're confronted. People change because they know someone. Psychologists refer to this as the contact effect, the idea that sustained exposure to people from marginalized groups is a reliable predictor of reduced bias. Not instantly or cleanly, but meaningfully. In that moment, I had disrupted something, not through confrontation, but through proximity, through the simple act of being here. But here's where my story could be easily misinterpreted if it was turned into a narrative on individual resilience. Because resilience was not the determining factor for me. Support was. My staffer, the person responsible with overseeing my performance throughout the summer, didn't minimize or ignore the fact that I was the only woman in my intern class. He acknowledged it, unprompted, asked questions, made sure I felt supported. My mentor, a managing director, did the same. Not asking questions about the work, but about the environment. Whether I had what I needed, whether I was okay. Several analysts and associates followed suit quietly, consistently, and intentionally. And research tells us why their effort mattered so much. Studies on psychological safety show that when leaders even just acknowledge difference, uncertainty decreases, the product improves, retention increases. When power names reality, it reduces the burden on those who would otherwise have to face it alone. The difference between surviving and succeeding in that room for me wasn't grit. It was access. But that's where the conversation around inclusion often stalls. Because we are so focused as a society on people's intentions. But culture doesn't change because people mean well. culture changes when people with power act deliberately. Research has found that inclusion accelerates when authority names difference instead of avoiding it, when they react early instead of reactively, when they use their credibility to legitimize others. That's not charity, that's design. And it's why disruption doesn't happen against people, it happens with them. We don't transform industries by dividing them into insiders versus interlopers. We transform industries when people inside the system decide to use their power differently. So what does disruption really look like? It might look like being the only woman in a room full of men. It might look like a mentor asking quietly and sincerely, "Are you okay here?" It might look like a young analyst realizing that a word he said casually actually mattered and deciding not to say it again. Or it might look like walking into a room where you were unexpected and choosing to stay because you think it can be better. But here's where I want to take a step back. Because you don't have to be a woman in finance for this to apply. You might be the first in your family to enter a profession. You might be a person of color in a homogenous field. You might be LGBTQ in a conservative industry. You might be disabled, younger, older, or simply unexpected. If you've ever walked into a room and felt the quiet realization that it wasn't built with you in mind, this is for you. But if you've ever been comfortably inside the room that was built for you, this is for you too. Because the future of every industry depends on two things happening at once. People being brave enough to enter into rooms where they were unexpected, and people inside those rooms being willing to make space. Culture doesn't change because of mere statements of intent. It changes because people decide that who gets to sit at the table actually matters. So what does disruption look like? Disruption doesn't have to be loud, doesn't have to be explosive. It can be steady, intentional, human. It can begin with the simple act of walking into a room, taking your seat at the table, and deciding to stay there long enough to change who gets to sit there next. Thank you.